Hey guys, it's Sasha, and I'm back with a recap of Pride and Prejudice. The novel opens with this sentence: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." And this is the theme of all that is to follow. Pride and Prejudice follows the Bennet family, but centers around the relationship of Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy. The story begins with the news that a wealthy young gentleman by the name of Charles Bingley has rented the manor of Netherfield Park and has brought his sisters and friend Mr. Darcy with him. It causes a great stir in the nearby village of Longbourn, especially in the Bennet household. The Bennets have 5 unmarried daughters. From oldest to youngest is Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. And Mrs. Bennet is desperate to see them all married, as the family estate will be inherited by William Collins, a distant cousin after Mr. Bennet dies due to an unfortunate law. The Bennets attend a ball at which Mr. Bingley is present. Mr. Bingley is outgoing and friendly, and he takes an interest in shy Jane, and spends much of the evening dancing with her. His close friend Mr. Darcy is less pleased with the evening, and haughtily refuses to dance with Elizabeth, which makes everyone view him as arrogant and obnoxious. Through the first interaction, Jane Austen shows the main themes of the book: Darcy's pride of rank and fortune, and the prejudice against the social inferiority of the Bennet family, and Elizabeth's pride of self-respect and prejudice against Darcy's snobbery. At social functions over the subsequent weeks, however, Mr. Darcy finds himself increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's charm and intelligence. Jane's friendship with Mr. Bingley also continues to burgeon, and Jane pays a visit to the Bingley mansion. On her journey to Netherfield, Jane is caught in a rainstorm, gets sick, and stays there for several days. Elizabeth stays at Netherfield to tend to Jane. During this time, Mr. Bingley's sister, Mrs. Bingley's spite increases towards Elizabeth and the Bennets when she notices that Darcy, whom she is pursuing, pays quite a bit of attention to Elizabeth. When Elizabeth and Jane return home, they find Mr. Collins visiting their household. Mr. Collins has decided the nice thing to do is to marry one of the Bennet girls in order to preserve their home. He makes a proposal of marriage to Elizabeth. Unfortunately, he's a complete fool, and Elizabeth hates him on sight. She turns him down, wounding his pride. Meanwhile, the Bennet girls have become friendly with militia officers stationed in town. Among them is Mr. Wickham, a handsome young soldier who is friendly towards Elizabeth and tells her how cruelly Mr. Darcy has cheated him out of an inheritance. At the beginning of winter, the Bingleys and Mr. Darcy leave Netherfield and return to London, much to Jane's dismay. A further shock arrives with the news that Mr. Collins has become engaged to Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend and the poor daughter of a local knight. Charlotte explains to Elizabeth that she is getting older and needs the match for financial reasons. Charlotte and Mr. Collins get married, and Elizabeth promises to visit them at their new home. As winter progresses, Jane visits London to see friends, hoping also that she might see Mr. Bingley. However, Miss Bingley visits her and behaves rudely, while Mr. Bingley fails to visit her at all. The marriage prospects for the Bennet girls appear bleak. That spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte, who now lives near the home of Mr. Collins' patron, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is also Mr. Darcy's aunt. Mr. Darcy calls on Lady Catherine and encounters Elizabeth, whose presence leads him to make a number of visits to the Collins home where she is staying. One day, he makes a shocking proposal of marriage, which Elizabeth refuses. She tells Mr. Darcy that she considers him an arrogant and unpleasant man, then scolds him for steering Mr. Bingley away from Jane and disinheriting Mr. Wickham. Mr. Darcy leaves her, but shortly thereafter delivers a letter to her. In this letter, he admits that he urged Mr. Bingley to distance himself from Jane, but claims he only did so because he thought their romance was not serious. As for Mr. Wickham, he informs Elizabeth that the young officer is a liar, and the real cause of their disagreement was Wickham's attempt to elope with his younger sister, Georgiana Darcy. This letter causes Elizabeth to reevaluate her feelings about Darcy. She returns home and acts coldly towards Wickham. The militia is leaving town, which makes the younger, man-crazy Bennet girls distraught. Lydia manages to obtain permission from her father to spend the summer with an old colonel in Brighton, where Wickham's regiment will be stationed. With the arrival of June, Elizabeth goes on another journey, this time with the Gardiners, who are relatives of the Bennets. The trip takes her to the north, and eventually to the neighborhood of Pemberley, Darcy's estate. She visits Pemberley after making sure that Mr. Darcy is away, and delights in the buildings and grounds while hearing from Mr. Darcy's servants that he is a wonderful and generous master. Suddenly, Mr. Darcy arrives and behaves cordially towards her. Making no mention of his proposal, he entertains the Gardiners and invites Elizabeth to meet his sister. Shortly thereafter, however, a letter arrives from home telling Elizabeth that Lydia, the youngest Bennet sister, had eloped with Wickham, and that the couple is nowhere to be found, which suggests that they may be living together out of wedlock. Fearful of the disgrace such a situation would bring on her entire family, Elizabeth hastens home. Mr. Gardiner and Mr. Bennet go off to search for Lydia, but Mr. Bennet eventually returns home empty-handed. Just when all hope is lost, a letter comes from Mr. Gardiner saying that the couple has been found and that Wickham has agreed to marry Lydia in exchange for an annual income. The Bennets are convinced that Mr. Gardiner has paid off Wickham, but Elizabeth learns that the source of the money and of her family's salvation was none other than Mr. Darcy. Now married, Wickham and Lydia return to Longbourn briefly, where Mr. Bennet treats them coldly. Then depart for Wickham's new assignment in the north of England. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Bingley returns to Netherfield and resumes his courtship of Jane. Mr. Darcy goes to stay with him and pays visits to the Bennets, but makes no mention of his desire to marry Elizabeth. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, presses his suit and proposes to Jane to the delight of everyone but Bingley's haughty sisters. While the family celebrates, Lady Catherine de Bourgh pays a visit to Longbourn. She corners Elizabeth and says that she has heard that Darcy, her nephew, is planning to marry Elizabeth. Since she considers the Bennets an unsuitable match for Darcy, Lady Catherine demands that Elizabeth promise to refuse him. Elizabeth spiritedly refuses, saying she is not engaged to Darcy, but she will not promise anything against her own happiness. A little while later, Elizabeth and Darcy go out walking together, and he tells her that his feelings have not been altered since the spring. She tenderly accepts his proposal, and both Jane and Elizabeth are married. And that is the end of Pride and Prejudice.